work session for today, October 20th. And this discussion will be on the federal and state legislative program. So I'll just go down the line. Ms. Omesh?
Here.
Ms. Tolan?
I'm here, thank you.
Ms. Corbett Sanders?
Glad to be here.
Ms. Keys Gamara?
Here.
Mr. Frisch?
Here.
Ms. Cohen?
Here.
Ms. McLaughlin?
Here.
Ms. Marin?
Here.
Ms. Sizemore Heiser? I'll come back to you. Dr. Anderson?
I'm here. I'm sorry, my audio was fuzzy for a while, but I'm here. Do you have another question for me that I may have missed?
No, we're good. We just started. That was my question when you wanted me to begin. Ms. Pekowski?
I'm still here.
All right, and I'll go back. Ms. Sizemore Heiser? Okay. Well, we're starting this work session, as I said, and today's objective is to look at the board program we have in place. Mr. Malloy, who is our lobbyist and representative down in Richmond, he has met, I think, with most of you to talk to you about your priorities and how you saw them fitting into our legislative program and speak to you specifically on these issues. And so today, what we will do is we will try to get to a place where we have lots of robust conversation on there's the several attachments that we have. One is our our program, our what do you want to say? It's 25-page legislative program. And what we can begin to discuss are our priorities as we have seen. And just so you know how the priorities came to be, because our legislative programming is so robust, a few years back, we decided to pull out priorities just to highlight key elements which we as a board are committed to. We have drafts of those. And we will go through that. And at this point in time, I will ask Mr. Malloy to begin his presentation.
Well, good morning, everyone, Madam Chair, members of the board, and Dr. Brabrand. I'm happy to be here to talk to you about the board's legislative program. Okay, so presentation has been pulled up. That's excellent. I just want to make sure to kind of set the context because a lot of this conversation requires you to look at multiple documents kind of at the same time. So I just want to make sure that if I'm referring to something that you understand where I'm referring to. The primary document that you're going to look at today it's called the strike-through draft. And we call it the strike-through draft because we design it exactly like you would proposed legislation at the state level or the federal level. So underlines are places where new language is being added. Strike through is where new language is being proposed to be deleted. So that's going to be the document that you're going to refer to, and you're going to see as we go through lots and lots of references back to that document, either by page number and or by position, letter, and number. Every single position in the program is actually coded by a letter designation and a number designation. So it makes it very easy for somebody to identify exactly what position we're referring to just by being able to say, we're looking at position D3 or something along those lines. So just in terms of navigation, I want to make sure that that's clear. The other documents you have, we call the second document the changes table. That's really just a reference for you. And we try to chronicle every single change and why the change was made within the legislative program. We do that position by position. So if it's an addition, if it's added to an existing program, language, if it's a deletion, it all should be listed on that document. So that's there for your reference. And The presentation today really is kind of a distillation of that document, and you'll see as I go through what I mean by that. And then finally, you also have an additional document beyond the strike through, which are board additions. These are positions that came up as part of the discussions that I had with individual board members or as part of 2x2 with board members. I didn't talk with everyone, but I did get to most of you. And these were some of the recurring themes that came up as parts of those discussions. And then finally, what was posted this morning are really intended as starting points for your discussion about priorities. So let me go ahead and launch into this presentation. So just as a reminder, legislative program is your set of position statements and your set of priorities related to policy interests that may be of interest to federal and state policymakers. It's trying to anticipate issues that are going to come up in the upcoming General Assembly session, and just a place for you all to be able to make a statement about particular issues across a broad spectrum of areas. This program is updated annually. It's based on changes that happen. So if a bill passed in the previous session, that should be reflected in language in the next iteration of the legislative program. It also reflects changing priorities and issues that may not have been important or even issues before that have become issues within that last year. We do everything from adding language, clarifying language that's already in the program. We try to consolidate to simplify as much as possible, because one of the recurring themes about the program is that even though we've pared it down from what it has been historically, and even the priorities, people still talk about it as being too long. So we're trying to consolidate as much as we can, while remaining true to the intent of the program, which is to make sure that it's reflecting your positions on various issues. And then we propose to delete some language throughout, either based on the issue being resolved or based on the issue being outdated. So it's just kind of obsolete language. This year's strike-through document is based on both staff recommendations and board discussions. You'll see throughout some of the changes that have been made actually came up as parts of discussions with individual board members, but also a lot of them came about as by way of staff recommendations. I mentioned the indexing by letter. And then the other thing to remember is that unless a position is changed, the language from the previous year will carry over to the next year. So, in terms of just kind of formatting changes and deletions, I'm going to refer you to a couple of places. The first is elimination of a standalone position on alternative education and moving that content under their existing student discipline position. In part, it was redundant. Student discipline position already had references to alternative education, and I think that those two things go together appropriately, so it makes sense to eliminate the standalone piece. And then going in exactly the opposite direction, we took the existing college readiness and post-secondary education position and split it into two different pieces. The first is a piece focused on college and workforce readiness, which is much more focused still on students who are in high school. And includes things like dual enrollment, which has a post-secondary component, but there still is that nexus to high school. Whereas the post-secondary education that was split off focuses in on things that are purely higher education related. So things like in-state, out-of-state ratios for schools have been moved into that. So that was why those two things were split. In terms of consolidation and eliminations of redundancies, the biggest changes you'll see are under the joint position, basically taking two paragraphs and turning it into one. After school programs, it was 4 bullets, it's now down to 2. And then there's a number of places in the SOA and SOL position that have been consolidated down. Again, the intent is not to change the position that the board is taking, it's simply to kind of consolidate the language because there are always redundancies that we find from year to year. And then finally, in terms of these changes, some positions have been moved to better align with subject areas. In part, they've been moved because of that creation of the college and workforce readiness position. So some things that were previously under SOA, SOL fit better under college and workforce readiness. And then under state funding, there were some issue-specific pieces there where it makes more sense to put them under individual issue areas and then have state funding be more generic issues of like formulas and such at the state level. So here are 5 entirely new positions that are included in the strike-through document. The first one is, really a response to the current pandemic and state revenue shortfalls and also declines in student population. So the program is proposing new wording under both the joint priority position and also under the state education funding position to address state support to help make up for revenue shortfalls, to help make up for declines in student population. Some of those issues were at least partially addressed in the special session, but they will carry over into the next session for sure. The next entirely new addition has to do with college and workforce readiness and deals with just making explicit your support for the current allocation of federal Perkins funding. Right now, Perkins funding that we get from the federal government, the state has discretion as to how that's split. Right now, 85% goes to K-12, 15% goes to higher ed. There have been discussions, particularly obviously from the higher ed side, to change that allocation so that more goes to higher ed. So just want to make sure that you're on record saying that you support the current split as it exists. The next is support for extending some of the emergency guidelines that have been put in place due to the pandemic regarding instructional time calculations. You will see later that there are other emergency guidelines that the state put in place which actually were already supported by your existing positions, so they're handled a little bit differently than this one, but this one is new. And then finally, on the state side, staff has identified an issue with the required parent-student driver education program, the one that's mandated only for Northern Virginia. There's no flexibility whatsoever for students who may, for whatever reason, not actually have access to a parent or a guardian, whether they're emancipated, whether they're over the age of 18. So it creates a barrier for those students to be able to fulfill this requirement. So we're looking for some flexibility there. And then finally, as a parallel to the state position, adding under federal position support for additional federal COVID-19 relief funding. So those are the entirely new, for all the changes that you see in the document, those are the only 5 entirely new things that are being proposed to add to the document in the structure version. So the next slide, and it would take me a long time to walk through all of this. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to at least look through the strike-through document. But this identifies the places where there are additions or new language that have been added to existing state positions. So it doesn't change a position, it just adds additional nuance. For example, under after-school programs, it adds a reference to opportunity gaps, which hadn't been addressed in that program before. Under attendance and truancy, it addresses flexibility for attendance and truancy in light of virtual schooling and being able to count virtual experiences as part of an attendance and truancy measurement. So that's what this page really is trying to list out, is all of the different changes that were made within existing positions where wording was specifically on. Let's see, next, under the federal positions, just to make sure you're aware, under Equal Rights Amendment, that was under the state program. That has been achieved on the state level, so we've switched that language over to the federal program, just to say that the federal government needs to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and then the tweak to the E-rate language. Now next, here's where we can tell you a little bit about some of your successes during the last General Assembly session, or places where language has dropped out. Under charter schools, there was some explanatory language that you didn't need. Same under the federal position there at the bottom of the list. The program, one of the reasons why the program was as long as it used to be is because not only did it include language on the board's position, but it also included in a lot of cases explanation for that position. What we've tried to do over time is we've tried to strip out the explanations, and we've tried to just focus in on the position itself and then the advocacy program that you all undertake and that we undertake when we go to Richmond. that's where the explanations come in, and that's also part of your presentation to the General Assembly, the Fairfax delegation that you have at your briefing, which is going to come up later in November. And then a couple of other places under English learners, under equal rights, under SOA, SOL, under student safety, you actually were able to achieve the objective of the position. So under SOA, SOL, the state adopted language that we had recommended in terms of making dual enrollment and high quality work-based experiences, having that count towards a student's graduation requirement for advanced coursework. Same for student safety. The General Assembly adopted language that you all had proposed for allowing there to be proxies so you could rely on staff to help with school safety audits. And then finally, the list on the bottom, I'm not going to go through all of it, but I just wanted you to see that there are a number of places in the program where your objective was at least partially achieved, but it wasn't fully achieved, so the language that was in the program is still retained. Great example of that, employer-employee relations. You adopted language, I think, in February regarding collective bargaining. The state did adopt a collective bargaining framework for local school divisions. That doesn't go into effect until May of next year. And there's always a chance that we'll come back and have further discussion on it. So I think it's important for you to keep the language in the program just to be prepared for future discussions. Now I'm going to turn to the board additions document. This is separate from the strike-through version, and these are the issues that came up in kind of recurring themes in conversations that I had with you all, and these are places where there would be either new items or new actual position areas that are proposed based on those conversations. You can see that it kind of spans the gamut in terms of issues. Environmental sustainability, there's actually language proposed both under college and workforce readiness to deal with work-based learning focused in on environmental sustainability careers, but also some additional nuance that you wanted to add to the environmental sustainability position having to do with alternative fuel buses, having to do with capital funding from the state. Cybersecurity, that's added as a concept and specifically named not only cybersecurity, but also data security, added as part of the educational technology position. A number of you mentioned concerns about open meeting laws, particularly the restriction on basically the 2x2 requirement that if more than 2 board members meet, it's considered an open meeting. The state law dealing with that does not account for board size. So if you have a board of 5, a meeting is more than 2, and if you have a board of 12, a meeting is more than 2. So there may be some room for adjustment there. Parity of elected boards. This actually came up as part of the conversation that we had at the state level on collective bargaining, but you also saw it when the state had to go in and adopt some emergency guidelines for you to be able to do virtual meetings. That your authority as an elected board did not match that authority of other local government elected boards, say boards of supervisors or city council. So this is asking just for parity in some of those authorities. Non-discrimination was a big topic of discussion for a number of you. What this would propose is an entirely new standalone position, the language of which focuses in on your existing policies on non-discrimination. Right now, in the existing program, the only place non-discrimination is mentioned really is under employer-employee relations. So this would pull it out and make it clear that it's applicable across to students, to staff, to whomever within the system. But it also would allow you to delete out that standalone or that position under employer-employee because this would be encompassing of that. A mention of allowing for telehealth Medicaid service billing, and then also support for specific remediation and learning recovery resources from the state, particularly to help with students who had some sort of learning deficits because of the pandemic. On the federal side, just a few examples or just a few additions that would come out of the board additions document. language about facilitating military transfers, which actually parallels language in your state position on, I think it's under IT, talking about facilitating transfers within the state. This is talking about facilitating and streamlining transfers for military students coming in and out of the system. Title IX was something that a number of you brought up, and the requirements that you all had to adopt some changes based on federal rules. This is essentially asking the federal government to return to the rules as they existed prior to that new rule was adopted in May, and then to go back through the rulemaking process. Cybersecurity and Medicaid distant service billing, they're just parallels to what I spoke of on the state side in the federal space. And then, so those are the strike-through document and the additions document. That makes up, that if you all adopt, that will make up all of the positions that the board takes. Then where you will go from there is that you will draw down from that set of positions, a set of priorities. And that's what the two documents that were added to the agenda item this morning were intended to do, to at least spur your conversation. In terms of your board conversation on what you might want to do with your priorities, there's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration. One is how many positions you want to take. Do you want to focus in on just a few, or do you want to have it be broad and expansive? Do you want to focus on issues that are immediately important, issues that are extremely highly important, or issues that come up every single year? As I mentioned in my presentation to you a little while ago, some of these issues have existed since the founding of the Commonwealth, but at least since the 1970s, in terms of Fairfax County School Board positions, because they're issues of annual importance, issues of school funding, issues of staffing ratios, those types of things. They come up recurring each year and each and every year. A couple of other considerations is, are you focusing in on things that are likely to pass, or are you focusing on things that are aspirational? Local composite index, great example. Big, complicated topic. You ask 132 school divisions, they will all say they dislike the way the local composite index works in terms of determining local wealth, but you're also going to get 132 different answers as to why they don't like it. So that's a big, important issue, but it's very complicated, and it may not happen within an individual session or even across a group of sessions. And then finally, as you're making your considerations for what you want to focus in on your priorities, is kind of statements that focus in on philosophy versus statements that are very actionable. An example of something that is actionable would be the example that I gave you on the driver's education, that that is easy to draw up a piece of legislation to have the state provide some flexibility for emancipated minors for that particular issue. But that may simply be a board initiative, something that you all wish to see go forward, as opposed to making it a quote unquote priority. So finally, and actually I believe this slide was in the presentation before, so I'll just highlight it. Your program, in addition to the formal joint position, which really focuses in almost primarily on funding, does have a number of parallels with the Board of Supervisors legislative positions. They're going through a parallel process right now of updating their positions, and I'm in communication with their staff over there to make sure that we're not getting crosswise in terms of any new initiatives either side has. And then finally, here is your timeline for not only the work today, but also the work all the way through the General Assembly session. You're scheduled for final action on this by November 5th. House and Senate Money Committee retreats meet November 17th through 20th. That's really kind of our first preview of where the state thinks things are going to go during the General Assembly session. So you'll get some revenue estimate updates, and you'll get some idea of what House and Senate are focusing in on kind of funding issues. Your delegation briefing is scheduled for November 23rd. Invites are going to go out for that before the end of this week. General Assembly members technically can be pre-filing bills right now, and they have until November 30th to do so. So again, once you've adopted and finalized your legislative program, we can have discussions with legislators about putting in bills prior to the General Assembly session. Just for those of you who are not familiar, pre-filing, legislators are oftentimes constrained in the number of bills that they can introduce. Pre-filing is treated differently than bills that they introduce during the session. There are different restrictions on what can and how many can be introduced. It's always an advantage, if at all possible, to get a bill to a legislator with pre-filing, because they have more flexibility when doing pre-filing as opposed to trying to do it during the General Assembly session. December 16th, you'll see the governor's biennial budget is released. That's where we will see all of the amendments that you will make to the current biennial budget. And then January 13th, 2021, the General Assembly opens its regular session. With that, that's kind of the introduction to all the documents that you have in front of you, and I will turn it back over to my meeting managers to go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Malloy, for that. I really appreciate it and all of your hard work to get us to today. I have several board members who are up for asking some questions, and I will start with Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Derenak Kofax. I wanted to just somewhat frame our discussion today because of the breadth of this document. And many people have over the years said, why do we have such a broad document as part of our legislative program? And I wanted to bring the attention of our board members to the why. And the why is because this is really a reference document because of the fast speed in which our legislature, especially in Richmond, addresses different issues. And so oftentimes, because of the rapidity of them addressing so many issues at a time, it is very helpful to have a broad document which they can use as a reference guide to better understand the needs or the requests of Fairfax County Public Schools. And because frankly, Michael is just a single person to be able to do that. And so I did want the board to understand that. I also wanted to reiterate the complementary nature of the federal and state programs. Because oftentimes, so for example, you will see some priorities in the state program that are not repeated in the federal program, but they will act as a reference point to inform work at the federal level. A good example of that is the Equal Rights Amendment, which has been part of our legislative program for several years. And now that it has been adopted at the state level, we know that we will need to do work at the federal level to get that passed. Similarly, the complementary nature of the language on non-discrimination as a standalone, that will inform the work of the federal level. And so I just wanted to kind of set the tone for that. I do have one question, and this is a question that Michael, you and I had as part of the meeting manager discussion, and that is about forced arbitration and the provision of our list, making them our student list, and the availability of those student lists to vendors and the conditions for that. And so if you could address that, I know that there are some people watching that are concerned about forced arbitration. And we have a congressman in Congressman Beyer who is advocating to have further restrictions on that. Thank you.
Ms. Corbett-Sanders, I apologize. I'm actually, the conversation isn't ringing a bell. I don't know if it came up as part of a different discussion, but I'm not, unfortunately, I must admit to ignorance on the particular issue that you're bringing up.
We had this discussion in the context of access to student lists and how restricting access to those student lists and the conditions for access to student lists, especially by vendors.
The state has the state in the last couple of years adopted some restrictions on kind of the sharing of personally identifiable information, which went kind of above and beyond what the federal requirements were in terms of being able to share lists like that. I don't know if there's a push to be able to get more of that information, but for the most part, In order for that information to be released, my understanding is the state has switched to an opt-in as opposed to an opt-out. So the default isn't that personally identifiable information can be released, or not personally identifiable, but information can be released unless a parent specifically opts out. But I think that the release is now that a parent would have to affirmatively say they want the information to be released in order for it to be sent out. It's definitely something we can look further into. I'm just not sure of the nuance of where the policy proposals are going.
This is in particular to the provision of those lists to vendors such as photography organizations or My School Bucks or other vendors that the school system actually engages with, and the limitations on those vendors as to how they can force a constituent into, or a consumer into, forced arbitration. And this was a discussion we had, but what I will suggest is that as a next step, that we make sure that that is included in our legislative package.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll make sure we get the right background and how it dovetails with what existing state law is, and that opt-in versus that opt-out provision.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Next is Ms. Sizemore Heiser.
Hi, great. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Malloy, for these detailed documents. I have actually not had a chance to talk to you one-on-one and meet with you. So I didn't realize we needed to have that done before today's meeting. So I will just sort of share some thoughts that you may not have heard from me yet. And hopefully there's still room to play with this. But one of the things I wanted to mention as I'm looking through this, I really appreciate the focus on, COVID issues and longer term issues around emergency guidelines for COVID. And this is on page 13 of the strike through draft. One thing I wanted to mention is that it's the long-term issues of COVID or a continuation of emergency guidelines isn't just around instructional time or the emergency, but there's going to be long-term impacts, especially for our current high school students, to earn those verified credits, especially for those students who are on the bubble, who may need to have done remediation and SOL retakes, but all of those have been canceled. For example, the SOLs were waived for last year's class, but anyone who needed remediation and retakes, my understanding, that was not waived. So these students are now being forced to do remediation and retakes 2 to 3 years later after they may have taken a class. And so I think, when we're looking at the long-term impacts of COVID, I think it's really important to look specifically at different groups and how that impacts them. So we're not unintentionally limiting our students' ability to graduate because of COVID. So that's something I think is really important. In addition, I think when we're looking, I'm really, really excited about our push for multiple pathways. This is on page 6, on a diploma. But again, the conversation around SOLs need to be part of that, because we can't, I've heard from many, many teachers and principals and staff that while they would love to encourage students to pursue multiple pathways and find talent, the SOLs and the need for those verified credits, especially for those who need remediation, sometimes hamstrings those efforts. So I think we really should look at how can we also have alternate methods for students to demonstrate competency and receive credits for a verified diploma, and maybe even looking at focusing on the portrait of a graduate skills, and how do we have, because the state has also adopted a portrait of a graduate program similar to what Fairfax County has. With this continued reliance on SOLs for graduation, it is difficult to have room for portrait of graduate skills. So I think it's got to go hand in hand with looking at, not just for special ed students, but for all of our students, those multiple pathways to a diploma and getting verified credit. It can't just be one without the other, or it really can't happen. So that's, I think, a really important piece of it. I mean, we talk about, for special ed students, a whole alternate methods to getting verified credits, and that's great, but I think maybe that needs to be broader if we're going to really be able to do anything on multiple pathways to a diploma. So I think it's really important to look at that. The other piece, and again, just a few things on page 15. We're talking about on number 23 about the driver's education in terms of parents, guardians who may not be able to attend. I think it's important to also look at, I'll take a go back if you want, but if I may finish my sentence, the requirement of driver's education for students with disabilities who may not drive, and what that may do, why is that still required, and is there some flexibility? And I'll take a go back. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Sizemore Heiser, if you can then you're kind of reading off a laundry list. So if you can be very succinct in your go back about explaining what your advocacy is for potential changes.
I will try to summarize that, and if there's still time when I meet with Mr. Malloy, I can try to go into that more detail too, but I'd be happy to sort of try to summarize the overall theme.
Thank you.
So, Ms. Fairfax, if I can respond just really quickly.
Yes, please.
So I think you're probably correctly identifying a deficiency in the language that we have here, that the flexibility really should be expanded because there were changes on the accreditation side, changes in graduation requirements that you may wish to see going forward. I think the trick will be in terms of determining which ones. You had everything from flexibility on not having to do hands-on CPR, all the way up to specific graduation requirements and specific testing requirements. I think we can do something kind of in generic language terms on flexibility in graduation requirements and accreditation flexibility for students that were impacted by the pandemic. So that isn't necessarily going to impact your kind of earlier grades, your younger students, but it will definitely impact the students who are coming closer to graduation, and even possibly 7th and 8th graders, depending on how long all of this lasts. So I think that's one. On the SOL side, I think one of the complications of the conversation about SOL requirements is that, remember, there's an overlay of federal testing requirements and state testing requirements. I think in some cases, the requirements that you're referring to are things that are being imposed by the federal government, because the federal government has said they're not going to provide continued flexibility on having to take assessments at the state level. Whereas I think if the state has its own, it could do it on its own, they might relax some of those requirements. So if I want to make sure when we advocate on that we're advocating both on that kind of federal backstop as well as the state flexibility. So that may be something that we would need to revisit in both the state program and the federal program.
Thank you.
I'll just go back. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Frisch.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Malloy, for all of your hard work on this. I know going through a document of this size with the lot of this school board is not an easy task. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that with us, especially for the 2/3 of us who are new to this process. Couple questions. One, as was indicated, I believe, by Ms. Corbett-Sanders, that we have a lot of different legislative priorities that come up at different times, maybe not in this General Assembly, but the next. I was struck by how succinct the county's federal and state legislative program is. When you're conducting your work based on this document down in Richmond, are you bringing into these meetings a more succinct version of the document? Like, here are our top priorities for the year?
To answer your question, Mr. Frisch, it's a little bit of both. It really, it depends on the issue areas that the individual legislator is dealing with. We have a really large delegation. We have 17 members of the General Assembly on the House side. We have 9 members on the Senate side that represent Fairfax. But they all focus in on different issue areas because they sit on different committees. So, when we have conversations, we try to target in on things that they're going to see first. So they're going to see particular issues. It's different if you're a member of our delegation who sits on the Education Committee versus a member of our delegation who sits on the Commerce and Labor Committee versus somebody who sits on technology, right? So they're going to be focused in on particular issues, and they're going to have a more robust discussion just based on how the General Assembly operates if they're in the subcommittee arena, and then a little bit less robust on the committee arena, then less robust when it gets to the floor. But really try and prioritize at that first lowest level with each one of our members based on where they sit in various committees. I think one distinction.
So it's not the kind of document that you just leave at somebody's office.
Oh, no, absolutely not. This is intended only really as a reference for them. I am always impressed when I come across staff members because I will get messages or I'll get communication from staff members in individual offices saying, hey, we have this bill coming up, we're interested in where you are on it. I noticed that on page 17 of the program, it says this, but it's not necessary. That's sort of responsive, but not necessarily responsive to exactly what the bill says. So, you kind of build the conversation based on what the actual legislation is doing. So this just kind of provides that backstop of, in the absence of us being able to get to you to talk about this, this is where we would be on a variety of different topics.
And does the county have a version that's comparable, that's like 20 pages or whatever?
The county does have, the county's program is not that much shorter than yours. They also have, they have their program, but then they call it, I think it's their Human Services White Paper, which is an entirely separate document, but focuses in on a number of other legislative issues. So they're presented at the same time, but they're really kept as kind of two separate pieces. Another difference, and please understand I am not advocating this, but just so you're aware, the county board meets every single week during the General Assembly session to discuss legislation. They are very, they meet every week. They come back on Friday, they have very long meetings, they discuss numbers and numbers of bills that are coming up. There are advantages and disadvantages to doing that. An advantage is the board has a much more robust discussion about issues and items. The disadvantage is that it slows down the advocacy process, is that, if you have to wait for, in every single instance, for the board to take a very specific position on House Bill 1, Senate Bill 2, House Bill 3, General Assembly moves fast, so it may very well be that you lose your opportunity to have that discussion at the subcommittee level where you can have the most impact. And so there are pros and cons to doing it either way. But that's another reason why I think theirs is a little bit less detailed than yours is just their difference in process.
All right. On some issue fronts, I'm pleased that the workaround coronavirus mitigation from the damage that's been done there is in there. Like Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, I think that we're still grasping what the long-term implications are going to be. I'm also happy to see that some of our conversation made it in there with the non-discrimination policy, reversing the Title IX changes that undermined victims of sexual assault and harassment. On page 12, when we talk about school construction, that might be a place where we can consider reinforcing the notion that we support or that we need additional support for green construction initiatives. And then in the environmental section, which is beefed up from previous years, thank you, we probably need to include information about waste reduction, recycling, and energy use / solar, in addition to our approach on electric vehicles, buses, and workforce development. Those are all areas that I know the county is going to be focusing on too. And inevitably there will be something happening in Richmond that we're going to have to keep our eye on that front. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frisch. Next, I have Dr. Anderson.
Thank this work. I definitely echo what Mr. Frisch has just shared. Boil this down to just a few items from all the discussions that with us. My first question is regarding the board discussions. You've listed 7 or so. Are these in order of occurrence with the school board? Because I want to get a sense of what you're hearing more and more about to the discussion of prioritizing.
You're referring to the document with the board additions?
Yes, the board additions, the 7, I believe, new items that you put on the slide. I can't remember the page.
It's not organized by frequency. It's organized by where they slot into the legislative program. So basically, it's it's just in order of where those positions would fit within the legislative program. So I did it exactly like I would if I would have slotted in for the strike through. So there's not a priority issue implied by that. I can tell you that of what's on there, the issues that came up most frequently among discussions, and in fairness, so for example, I met with Carl with Mr. Frisch initially, so he didn't have the advantage of hearing what other members had been talking about. So he was kind of the first one, and it rolled on from there. So I don't necessarily know where he stands on these things, but definitely the discussion about non-discrimination, discussion about Title IX, discussion about cybersecurity, because that's a relatively new and very familiar topic to a number of you, and then a lot of discussion about the state's open meeting laws and just the inefficiencies of having to do everything on a 2-by-2 basis with a board as large as yours is. So those, I think, would have been the most commonly recurring themes. And then the other ones that came up were ones that were mentioned by more than just a few or a single member.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. I don't know if you were still speaking. I stopped hearing you.
Yeah, I was finished.
Okay, thank you. My other question is regarding the fact that obviously a number of us have not done this before. And one of your slides, you talked about our considerations in terms of prioritizing how many issues of importance, issues of high importance or immediate annual importance. What guidance do you have just to help anchor our thinking for those of us who haven't engaged in this previously?
I think a couple of things. One is purely just a kind of a stylistic approach, is to make sure that you keep whatever your priorities are to a single page. Once you get past a single page worth of items, people start to not pay attention or start to say, well, that's everything. So you want to make sure that you try and focus in on at least not so many things that you're diluting the message of the ones that you have on there. In terms of specific priorities, I mean, I think that given the environment we're in right now, you probably want to have some statements both on the funding side and on the policy side on COVID-related flexibilities and extended COVID-related flexibilities. That can come in a number of different forms. That can come in the form of electronic meetings. That can come in the form of if you all decide to add the language on standard of accreditation graduation requirements, on attendance. So I think you really want to make sure that those things are addressed. And then from there, it really is just kind of an exercise for you all as a board to decide what the most important things are to kind of put in front of General Assembly members. Certainly doesn't preclude you from putting other things in front of General Assembly members. So for example, what I was talking about for driver's ed, if that's not considered a priority, that still is something that if you all were to adopt, we would try to find a bill sponsor to put that flexibility in place, right? So there's still a distinction between, even though it's not listed as a priority on your priority sheet, it's still something that we would move forward with as a particular initiative. And we've done that bifurcation for a number of years, where you have kind of the big, broad, important pieces that you focus in on, but also the few pieces of legislation that you specifically want to address with General Assembly members.
Okay. The other question that I have is regarding the next to last bullet on that page, issues that have a likelihood of passage versus issues that are aspirational. I would guess that some of the issues that are aspirational have been part of the package for a number of years. Should we put our eggs in that basket? Should we focus more on the likelihood of passage matters in lieu of that? Or is it more of a statement that we continue to keep those aspirational matters in our agenda?
I think historically we've leaned towards trying to keep those issues on the list, even though we know that there may, it may continue to be a multi-year conversation. As you're aware, as an elected official, oftentimes the issues that are in front of you are the issues that are in front of you. And they may or may not be the important ones, but they're the ones that have come up and the ones that are addressing a particular emergency or a particular situation. If you stop asking, if if you stop having some of those things as your priorities, you run the risk that people will say, well, they don't care about that anymore. That's not an issue for us anymore. So again, I can't give you a hard and fast rule, but there is that balance to be aware of, that if you don't put kind of the longer term and frankly eye-rolling esoteric pieces like the way the state averages teacher salaries. They use a weighted average that really underestimates the amount that we actually spend in Fairfax County. But again, that's really kind of really specifically in the weeds. That's something that's of critical importance, because if we could ever change that formula, it would mean a lot in terms of our, the funding that might come back to Fairfax. So I just want to caution, I want to make sure that you focus in on things that are important and things that are actionable. But I also want to make sure that you at least have some sort of a general philosophical statement or general mention of, and we still have these long-term pieces that we want you to be working on over time.
Thank you. That's very helpful in terms of strategizing how I will start to begin to prioritize some of our discussion points here. That's very helpful to hear. So thank you for that. My final question is to the meeting managers, actually, because Ms. Denrak Koufax, I know both you and Ms. Corbett Sanders have engaged the board in these matters multiple times over the last years. How do we typically have our board come to these priorities? Do we go around the room and everybody shares what they want as a priority? If you could walk me through that process a little bit, just to grab my thinking.
Sure, I can start. I think some of the, as I noted, part of the reason some of these priorities were pulled out, and particularly the aspirational ones, when you talk about funding formulas and pre-K, these have been issues that we have been advocating for but have seen little traction. But they're so important to improving the quality of what educational options we are able to provide here in Northern Virginia, that we put together this document probably sometime over the last 8 to 10 years. And the way we have done it is kind of the way we're doing it today. These are priority positions based upon what Michael heard, what Karen and I have heard in various conversations. And then at this point, because I think my advocacy at this point would be to take this document, people get back to us if you have the opportunity. I don't even know, you as the chair could speak to us whether or not it would be better to have a work session. But at this point in time, I think what I would prefer, rather than wordsmithing or something, is to get back to us, see if we can come to a consensus on that offline. And then if we needed another work session, we would do that. That's kind of a historical way it started, what we have done in the past, and where options for where we can go now.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Karen?
If I can just add to that, and kind of also respond to Carl's question a couple of minutes ago about the difference in the size of our legislative program at the beginning of the year versus the counties. The difference is the county throughout the legislative session has a work session once a week or once every 2 weeks, in which they are continuously adding more to their plate based on or responding to what's happening in Richmond. We have taken a different approach because, frankly, resources and the resources available to the school board, the amount of time people have, and all of the various issues before the board. And so that's kind of why we have a broader starting point, and then to address the concerns that Carl mentioned. A number of years ago, the board decided to start this prioritization document, and that prioritization document is more reflective of what are the core issues that or priorities, as Tammy put, that explained, what are those issues that are so essential to being a successful world-class school system, and that's how we kind of set our priorities document. There is nothing that precludes us from being able to respond to new issues as they come up. It's just that our flexibility of bringing everybody together at one given time is more difficult. And that's why the approach differs between what we do and what the county does. Does that help?
It does. I just wanted to be sure that I understood what the process that we were going to take to get to that core list, and also those statements in terms of how to approach how many things we present was also very helpful. And so I think I'm good for right now. I may have some follow-up questions a little bit later on, but this is helpful. So thank you to both of you and to Michael for the clarification.
Great. And Tammy and I will be reaching out to everybody between now and the actual vote on this document.
Okay, thank you.
So if I can add just one additional thing in terms of what you have in front of you on the kind of the, and I was careful to call these initial discussion drafts because these are really intended to be the beginning of your discussion about prioritization. State document's a little different than the federal document. The federal document, I think, is a little bit more focused. The one that we provided in terms of the issues that you might want to prioritize. There's not a lot of other things that could be brought up that I think would raise to the level of priority on the federal side. State priority side is trickier just because the state is much more expansive, has much more to do with your day-to-day operations. We also have a much more direct connection in terms of state activity versus federal activity. Federal lobbying and watching what happens at the federal level is very different than it is in terms of the process that we undertake during the General Assembly session and how kind of embedded and a part of the conversation we are at the state level. The state document you have in front of you is too long. I would not, I mean, advocacy would not be to use every single one of those things, but I wanted to make sure that I pulled out a number of items that you all should look at in terms of consideration for possible priorities. And it's everything from things that have been in the program for decades to issues that are coming up just as part of today's conversation on some of the new issues. So it runs the gamut of positions involved.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And next we have Ms. Marin, followed by Ms. Toll.
Thanks. I have a question, Michael, for you, and then another question for our meeting managers. Michael, it's occurring to me that nowhere, to my knowledge, or did anyone, are we talking about trying to advocate to put a pause on the SOLs, the tests, as we did in the spring because of COVID? Did anyone talk about that? Is that a viability?
No one brought it up specifically. I mean, it's obviously something that you could pursue. Part of the complication, I think, is the federal side of the requirement, because the federal government, at least for now, obviously we may have changes in November and we may not have changes in November. But for now, the U.S. Department of Education has told states, go forward with your testing program, they are required. So the state doesn't have a ton of flexibility, particularly for anything that's required for federal accountability, for the federal accountability side. Now there are some differences in terms of what's required at the state level and what's required on the federal level. The state does have tests that are not specifically required. But at least right now, the environment is that we are required to go forward with the SOL testing program because of federal requirements. As I said, it's certainly something that you could add in terms of your advocacy. It would dovetail with a lot of other position language, and it would also dovetail with the position language that Ms. Seismore-Heiser was bringing up in terms of flexibility for graduation requirements and flexibility for accreditation requirements.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for reminding me of that.
One second, Ms. Marin. It looks like Dr. Brabrand had his hands up for this.
Yeah, just a quick point, Ms. Marin, that Michael said. We have waived the SOL testing for this spring. The state superintendent supported that. And I was part of a committee with the city of Charlottesville superintendent and Salem superintendent. We recommended the state superintendent earlier this fall to waive the SOLs for this year. That has been done. But that does not waive us from taking the SOLs. It just waives us for accreditation purposes for the state. The feds have been asked, the state superintendent has asked Betsy DeVos, as has other state superintendents, and the answer has been a clear no. SOLs will continue. State assessments will continue. I do agree with Mr. Malloy. It will really, I think, fundamentally depend on whether we continue to have the same Department of Education administration or a new one as to whether we'll get a different answer about that. If this board wants to revisit that issue after the election, I think it's certainly appropriate to do so, and then we can message to the state and to the federal government, working with Karen and Tammy appropriately.
Okay, thank you for that information. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to revisit it. I will hope for the best and hope we can revisit it.
If I can offer, Ms. Marin, just real quick, that we do not vote on this legislative package until after the election. So you have some flexibility to add an amendment if you like.
Yeah, thank you. You know, my comments really mirror Dr. Anderson's. You know, I'd like us to use this time wisely. And, you know, I don't feel like I have questions for Mr. Malloy. I really want to figure out how we can get to some consensus. And we often have this, you know, line we're trying to walk between being transparent and getting things done, you know, as we can to be prepared. But we're here right now. I'd like to, you know, if someone can help us talk through some of this and come to some consensus, that would be really helpful rather than trying to have 2-by-2 conversations for the next 2 weeks. So, you know, I think unlike some other presentations, perhaps, it's clear where we're at. People have spoken. Can we have some kind of facilitated discussion to try and get some pulses of the board to help prepare us for that vote? Because otherwise, I'm not really sure. I'm just hearing everyone's input, which is fine, but then we're back to doing 2-by-2s for the next 2 weeks. So.
I will just speak to that at this point in time. I'm not certain what your advocacy is, other than are you advocating now for us to, I think because number one, there are some board members that have not met, at least a couple. So I feel like we kind of need to have Michael have that conversation with some of them. And then, but what is your advocacy at this point? When you say a facilitated discussion to discuss which portion, the 25-page document, priority positions?
I would say the summary of recommended changes to 2020 positions. I mean, my understanding is I might have been the last interview, and I think there were 2 people who didn't get to speak with him. But I think, you know, this also gets to the point of how are we doing our work? Are we going to sit here and ask questions and more questions? Or maybe then we just take this and that's it. I mean, I just have individual people ask questions when each of us had an hour with him to do that. Doesn't really seem like a great use of collective time. So if people have questions about, you know, should we change things or not? I feel like that's a productive conversation. I mean, do people agree to go through and ask questions? More of a dialogue than just us firing questions at Michael.
Well, that was supposed to be the opportunity for today, respectfully, Ms. Marin. The summary of changes is available to be highlighted if you have questions on specific ones. I think the state priority positions, I think that would take much longer than 2. The reason we did not go over these changes line by line, I will tell you, it took Ms. Corbett Sanders and Michael and I 2.5 hours to do that. And so we felt it was a better use of our time to have this opportunity to say, these are the changes. We're going to, if you have questions on them, yes, please do that. To go over each change individually was quite the time we're constrained by our time here as we are on so many issues. And as Ms. Corbett Sanders, the resources of this board compared to other boards. So we are available to talk about any of these. If you have that, we can continue along that line for the duration of your time here, or I can have a go back. But everything is up for, I don't see a need to do any more. As Karen said, we'll reach out to you unless you don't need reached out to and you're okay. I think where we need to do the reach out is on our state priority positions, as this is a first draft, basically that takes some information from previous boards and some from what we're seeing right now particularly on the pandemic. So I appreciate your advocacy, but we will do our best to ensure that this dialogue, that's why we still have 45 minutes on it to discuss whatever's on board members' minds.
Well, thank you for appreciating my advocacy for our advocacy. So I think that perhaps, and it's a good topic for a retreat or something, like how we come to these discussions. But so I'll just leave it at that. But thanks for considering that idea.
You're welcome. I next have Ms. Tolan.
Hi there, and thank you for all the work that Karen and Tammy and Michael that you've done on pulling all of this stuff together. It's a lot of information. I don't have a lot of questions, so but I will mention the things that I think are important, and I have one comment. I highly support any of our activities around workforce development, dual enrollment, just really ways that we can look at restructuring our high school experiences and high school graduation so that we take into consideration some of these alternative ways that students can get experience and credit for the work that they're doing. So I know we have that shows up in a number of areas through this document, and I'm excited to see as much of that as possible, including the mention of working, of course, on the green careers. I also, on the environment side, wanted to follow up on what some of the things Mr. Frisch said. He and I will be presenting the joint environmental task force goals on Thursday at our board meeting, and agree that perhaps we should look at our environmental sustainability language that we're adding. And so Michael, I'd ask you if you could help us coordinate with the county. They're presenting the exact same goals that we are. But, and we have some very aspirational goals around energy management, around carbon neutrality. So actually mentioning carbon neutrality in our legislative program might be important under sustainability, but I'd like that coordinated with some of the wording that Fairfax County is moving forward with, given that we've got the same set of goals. And then of course, any of the things that we can do to make our school board work more efficient, given the number of topics that this board deals with. So the parity of the elected boards, the open meeting rules, et cetera, really support looking at that. And I, of course, support any that we can get around cybersecurity. I think that's just becoming more and more an issue across the entire world, and something that school districts need to stay on top of, and we need help. So with that, those were my biggest comments and areas of consideration. Thank you so much again for all of this work.
Thank you, Ms. Tolan.
So if I may ask Ms. Tolan a real quick question.
Yes, please.
This may also be for Mr. Frisch, because you all are more familiar with the joint task force recommendations. In terms of the recommendations that are in that document, are they focused more on kind of local aspirational? So there are things that you as a board and the Board of Supervisors as a board has control over, or are there things that would require either legislative, so there are barriers on the legislative side? An example of that might be something along the lines of cap that the state still has, even though they expanded it on the kind of the size and number of solar projects that can occur in a particular region. So if there's language that we need to add, hopefully we'll be able to focus it in on things that maybe the General Assembly isn't doing, or whether or possibly on resources that the General Assembly could provide.
Okay, that sounds good. And I can also offer that we can work more closely with our counterparts, Dan Stork and Penny Gross, on what they're putting forward at the county level too, and we can make sure that our language matches that and get that to you. In order to meet the goals that we have over a 20-year and more time frame, we definitely could use some support at the state level. We will need to increase our use of renewables, for example, as you brought up, and the support for sustainable infrastructure will be important. Thank you.
Do you need to go back?
I think I'm done. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Next, I have Ms. Cullen.
I'm grateful to follow that conversation. My advocacy to my colleagues in terms of what should drive priorities, to me would certainly be sort of summarizing what Mr. Malloy just said, which is I think in this year and looking what the budget may look like and looking what the world may be like, my advocacy to all of you would be focusing our priorities on barriers instead of more general aspiration. I think when my conversations with our members of the Senate and the House of Delegates certainly has been that that's the most helpful advocacy that they can get from us. What are things that they are wholly in control of that they could change that would be the most helpful? So, a big point to me, certainly in my conversations with Mr. Malloy, were what are the things that are barriers to us being able to do our job more efficiently? And I think that's a huge piece, the idea that the 2-person meeting rule doesn't have any context or size for the biggest school board in the Commonwealth. And certainly 3 members of a board means something on a 5-member board, but 2 members or 3 members in theory in a 12-person board certainly doesn't mean the same thing. So even just to the community, if anybody is brave enough to be watching today, that's one thing I would say when you invite all of us to be part of a town hall, for example, unless you are able to do that in a way that we can advertise it and get it 3 days ahead and all of the rules, we are not able to participate in things even in the community in a way that I think folks would like us to. And I definitely understand that, and I understand the frustration. And in terms of us, getting our work done, I think about even with you, Mr. Malloy, how much easier it would be and how much less time it would take if you met with 3 of us at a time instead of 2 of us at a time. So that would be my advocacy to my colleagues, is narrow as possible. Yes, this bigger document is good background to have, but narrow, what are the barriers to making us more efficient and keeping our kids from the best education they can have versus this year being aspirational in the priorities. So that's just my advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cullen. Ms. Omesh.
Yeah, thank you. Actually happy to follow those points, and I'll comment on it in a second. But thank you to Mr. Malloy and Mr. Fairfax and Ms. Corbett-Sanders for your work on this. I'll start with a question. Mr. Malloy, can you just give us a sense of how weighty our feedback has been in the past, whether that's because of how much it is or just in general, what influence it's had at all and what we would expect, just to shape how much time and investment we put into this?
So I think everybody wants to know where Fairfax stands. I mean, it's true across it. It's not just education issues. Everybody wants to know where Fairfax stands just because of our size. Things obviously look very different once you leave Fairfax and go to Richmond, right? I mentioned that we have by far the biggest delegations, but it still is only 17 members out of a required 51 to get to a majority. Same on the Senate side, it's only 9 members out of a required 21 to get to a majority. So And so you have a good deal of influence because you have a lot of people sitting on a lot of committees. You've got a education committee, but at the same time, legislators are balancing kind of what they hear and see from Fairfax versus what they hear and see from home. And the adage that all politics is local is very much true. I can tell you that no matter how eloquent anybody speaks on a bill, if there's a fiscal impact statement, the very first thing that a legislator will do will be to look at the spreadsheet that determines how much funding is being sent to every single jurisdiction and see how their jurisdiction does. Quite aside from the importance of the policy, quite aside from the content, that's kind of the first thing that they're gonna focus in on. So it really depends on the types of issues that you're trying to advocate as to whether or not you're going to run into those kinds of barriers versus just having a pure policy discussion. I think also the default position of virtually every school board, yours and all others, is the more flexibility, the better. Is the more the state tries to place restrictions, the more the state tries to place specific requirements, the harder localities, local governments, school boards will push back on that. So again, it's going to depend a little bit on the issue areas that you talk about. You saw on the one slide the areas where we're able to pull language back out of the legislative program because your objectives have been achieved. There's actually a larger number of those this year than in years past, but we do have, and I know Ms. Darren Fairfax has asked about this before, and I can provide to the board kind of the last few years of all the places where you've been able to pull things out that you've advocated for. And there's always issues every single year that get pulled out because we've been successful legislatively. Then there are also areas where you make progress towards a goal, but you don't necessarily complete the goal. So legislative program language stays, but as an example, this year, the General Assembly increased the number of positions and increased funding for English language learner teachers a little bit. Didn't increase it to the point where we wanted to, but it did make progress towards that. Same for school counselors. Additional resources were put in for school counselors. So again, every single year you're making progress towards some of these goals, even if the legislative program language stays exactly the same. There still has been progress made, at least on the way towards that ultimate goal.
Okay, thanks. And in terms of those who do represent our county, in getting them to be on board, I guess that's pretty just formulaic, right? They end up supporting these positions because we set them.
I wouldn't want to say that that's necessarily universal. Everybody has their own political philosophies, but you as a board member are probably able to get into any legislator's office to talk to them as representing Fairfax because you both represent Fairfax. So the willingness to listen to the positions in the legislative program, the willingness to listen to your priorities, our delegation is universally very receptive. They may not always land on the same side as you put them to, but they're always very receptive to your argument.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. This gets me to some of what people were talking about earlier, which is how we do this, scheduling wise and how we take it in. Frankly, I don't know that due diligence is really doable on this without a more, section by section or some kind of review that allows us to look at it. So I would imagine maybe even in how we organize our conversations or the 2x2s, if we can take it in chunks or have those be delineated, I think that would be helpful. Given the extent of the information, even in just reviewing this for today, I would want to ask a bunch of questions about the rationale, what staff input is on each component, which is impossible. But that's where, some of the feedback I think is coming directly from staff to inform the agenda. But then, it doesn't seem to fit with our role as an oversight board and our legislative role in interacting with our state colleagues. So that's something to think about big picture, I think, for us as a board. Maybe I would even suggest in thinking for the following year, if we can plan that we actually look at this earlier. So like at the end of the year, maybe into informing the following year. So we have our opportunity to do some of that advocacy or break it down. that's something I would just put out there for consideration. The second thing is defining our role in this also. You know, we can be a typical organization that just has its lobbying agenda and as a stakeholder of many others in the state, or we can also be kind of take a different advocacy or leadership role in what we would like to see in education. So I hope that that's something maybe we can discuss at the retreat or in shaping what do we want out of our advocacy role here. But focusing on this, those are two things I do want to flag and I think are critically important for us to figure out as a board moving forward. But for the priorities here, I want to second Ms. Cohen's point on the barriers for us doing our work. I think in looking at the draft document right now, I would add the flexibility piece, as she pointed out, not just for meetings, but potentially virtually and that kind of flexibility. And the second theme that I really want to see reflected, which is missing, is gaps related to education, student outcomes that we're anticipating because of COVID. So technology, language, special ed, compensatory services, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Ms. Omesh. Ms. McLaughlin? Mr. Malloy, sorry. Did you want to speak to any of Ms. Omesh's points? I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I think you make some good arguments that again, I think there's a difference between what goes into the main document, so the broad priorities in terms of that discussion, versus the board's discussion about what of those broad priorities you're going to pull out as your specific priorities that you're going to identify, as opposed to just the broad positions. I think there are two different types of discussions that you all have to have as a board. This forum, I think, is better suited for the conversation about whether or not you all believe that the changes on the strike-through document and then also the changes that were included as part of the board additions document are appropriate for that to go forward. And then once that's set up with you as a board, then that conversation shifts to how do you prioritize among the various things that are in that document.
Thank you for clarifying that again, Mr. Malloy. I appreciate it. Ms. McLaughlin.
Okay, thank you. I really want to echo Ms. Marin's concerns about how and what is the best approach for us as a collective body to determine what, if any, advocacy changes to specific legislation we would want to consider for 2021. So I also appreciate what Mr. Malloy just said right now. Thank you, Michael. I think you framed that up beautifully, that, collectively right now, where are we on the strike through, the changes you're suggesting as the expert lobbyist for Fairfax County Public Schools? Is there any objections among this body on those proposed changes? And then what, if any, additional changes would this group of 12 want to see? And so, I do think it will be important going into the vote 2 weeks from now. Do people have any objections? And to what others have been talking about, and we talked about in the forum, we're really pressed right now with a focus on returning students to in-person learning, and also trying to then balance the annual work that we know is important, and having a voice in our General Assembly is a very important part of that. I do want to just make my colleagues aware, to Ms. Marin's advocacy, I've got 2 issues that I will be sending you information on and lobbying this board to finally take a strong position. And that has to do with school nurses. And the second one has to do with religious exemptions. And Michael and I have talked about this for years, about religious exemptions. I do think it will require getting sponsors in the General Assembly to do that. But for colleagues who have not heard me speak about this before, I want to just make clear where my concerns are. A 2012 study was done by the Just Children advocacy group out of UVA, Andrew Block, who then went on to run the juvenile justice department for Virginia for the past 5 years, authored that study. And what it found is that over 7,000 Virginia students every year qualify and receive religious exemption from public education. But what they found is because Virginia is the only state among 50 that does not require any documentation of any kind by the parents, that up to 7,000 children who get the religious exemption versus homeschooling in Virginia, there's no evidence that they get any education at all. And so there's a couple of Washington Post stories that are great. I will send you the 48-page study as well. But we are the only state in the union that is not doing our job to ensure that children are getting education. So at that point, my time is up. And if we have time for go back, I would like to go back and talk about ownership.
Yes, it looks like we will have time. I will put you on the list, Ms. McLaughlin.
So real quick
yes,
for Ms.
yes.
Ms. McLaughlin, I'll help a little bit. So on both of those issues, I just want to make sure that the rest of your colleagues are aware that thanks to your advocacy, there actually are already legislative positions in the program itself. So on religious objections, there's if you look under item C3, there's already language that at least addresses that. It hasn't been necessarily an initiative for General Assembly members, but it is part of your package. And also on school nurses, that's discussed in both positions Y1 and Y2. That separates out the funding part of the conversation from the actual how to go about doing it in terms of specific staffing model conversation. But I just want to make sure that your colleagues were aware that those two things are included, at least in some fashion, in the existing document.
Thank you, Mr. Malloy. But as noted, it's among a volume of other things and whether we prioritize it or not for this year. So thank you.
Thank you. And before I go backs, I will speak briefly. I just want to thank Mr. Malloy for all of your work that you do. And I want my colleagues to understand how Mr. Malloy is looked upon by not just our NOVA delegation, but as a go-to person. He is, this is the bad terminology, Michael, but he is the ultimate policy wonk. He knows the details. He knows where the skeletons are hidden. He knows why legislation didn't pass before. So we are very fortunate to have Michael on our team for so long. I have everyone from the current Speaker of the House on down to people in other parts of the state who go to Michael to utilize his expertise. So I thank you for that. My colleagues, we do realize that we are in an extremely unique position. Some of the things that we may need to put in our 25-page document or things which we don't currently have a consensus on. And part of that is because of where we are right now. We are in a pandemic. We are still a fairly newly constituted board. But I think Michael has, and I said that all about Michael to illustrate to you the detail work that he did do on this summary of recommended changes. But also, as your board representatives, Karen and I did spend, as I said, over 2.5 hours just on this to ensure that the changes were reflective of what we heard in our conversations were with you and what Michael heard in his conversations with you. So today, as we move forward, I think what we can do, because we have some go backs and I look at the time and I'd like to stay on schedule, is we can come to a general consensus. Again, this is a work session. That this document right now, with the changes that is standing there, we are comfortable, noting that we still have time. If you have further questions, Michael is available, Karen and I are available. We can move. So I would like to, in a general way, move forward with that. As far as the priority positions and what we want to see, I do really appreciate my colleagues that are advocating for the need to how to make our work better. But I also want to ensure that, you know, as we go through this, Michael says it's too long. And I think I would like to hear a little bit from you, Michael, what you might recommend as far as, and I'm talking about our state priority positions, because I think the federal ones are easier. And I think that's probably at a good place and a good point. I kind of would like your opinions on what you think we could or should tweak. And then as we go over the next few weeks, remember we have till November 23rd to do this. If I feel like in our conversations, we are not at a point where we can have, where we can present to you something, then I will work with the chair and vice chair to add an additional work session on this. But Michael, if you could kind of just speak in generalities where you think this state priority position could be condensed.
I'm happy to do that, or do you, should we maybe wait until we go through the go backs in case there are issues that are brought up as those, and then I can kind of sum up once we've gotten through
Absolutely.
all that conversation?
Absolutely, that will be just fine.
Okay.
And I see, before we go backs, I see Ms. Keys Gamara has raised her hand and she has not spoken yet. So I will start with her and then go backs.
Thank you, Ms. Fairfax. I just wanted to give a perspective in light of a meeting I had yesterday. I do agree that we may want to highlight what some of our barriers are or some of our, I would say, Uber type priorities are. But the other thing is that oftentimes what's on that list, I think, is comparable to the recommendations that we get from some of our committees. We know that it's impossible to go through the 15 or 20 or so recommendations we get from the HR committee and the MSAOC and on and on. But the fact that those issues have been researched and we have a guideline for what the concerns are from each of those topics is helpful to us so that we know that we have that research. So similarly, I think that we might be able to look at our legislative agenda here for those members of the Virginia legislature in particular that are actually looking for topics that they may want to bring forward. So I think the fact that we've spoken on those issues can be helpful to them. But having said that, I would agree with, I think it was Laura Jane Cohen that said, you know, we may want to identify barriers if we choose to deal with those. So I'm suggesting that perhaps, and I would ask Mr. Malloy if it's appropriate to have an additional type of cover letter to say, these are the things that may need to be dealt with in light of the fact that we're dealing with COVID or whatever we might identify, but still leave some of these other issues available. So for those who are looking for additional issues.
I think your point, Ms. Keys-Gamara, it's a very good one. And it also draws a distinction between your legislative program and your legislative advocacy. They really are two different things. The legislative program provides kind of the baseline for where the board's positions are, and that's augmented by, policies and priorities that the board has adopted that may not be in the legislative program, but they give clues as to where the board's position on particular issues stands. So that kind of provides the baseline, and then what you do with that baseline is you have the conversation with individual legislators or with legislators collectively. You'll have an opportunity to do that in person as a group as part of your legislative briefing later in November. So we invite all legislators in, and then you all are able to kind of present the legislative program, but also really kind of use that as an opportunity to highlight with legislators what your priorities are. But I also encourage every single one of you to make sure that you are in contact and communication with your legislators, people that are in your, that where you share jurisdiction, is to make sure that you are having conversations back and forth with them, because the more we can know about where legislators' priorities are, the more effective I think we can be. So if there are issues that are coming up that they're prioritizing that may not be on your priority list or may not be something that the legislative program is even responsive to, That's really important information to have. So those conversations that you have in the community with your constituents, with your legislators, who in ways are constituents as well, are critically important for your all success.
So thank you. I just submit that as, as another tool that may help our fellow board members to feel a little bit more comfortable, and we're not all over the place, but at least we've made a statement on various issues in the event that a legislator, a particular member of the legislature is interested in that issue. And I'm certainly happy to reach out to my representatives to assist in that process so that we can bring collectively that information. So thank you, Mr. Malloy.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. I will now go to our Fairfax, and I will start with Ms. Sizemore Heiser.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I as I'm sitting, I'm trying to come sort of distill down your request, Ms. Janet Kofax, and a very fair one about sort of the broad topics instead of a laundry list. And I will say, and I will own this, but as perhaps a new board member, I was not clear on the timeline of when some of these conversations needed to be completed. My understanding was more by November. So I haven't had a chance to either talk to Mr. Malloy or to my colleagues, Ms. Janet Kofax or Ms. Sanders, really in detail about some of our priorities. So, I do think that there is time and room for discussion. The only thing, to sort of distill what I had to say earlier is I really do think as we're looking at our COVID issues around COVID, and I totally hear and respect what you said, Mr. Malloy, about the federal sort of hard line on standardized tests. And I completely do understand that, but perhaps after the election, perhaps not. But the impact of SOLs is going to be on both accreditation and on high school graduation, on remediation needs, is going to be a long-term effect for our high school students. And it's going to be a barrier to their pursuing a diploma if they have to take mediation and an SOL 2 to 3 years later after they took that course. So I do think it is an important piece, perhaps even to discuss when you have on page 1 of the recommended board additions, when we talk about remediation learning recovery, to even put in there and alternate methods to, instead of having an SOL, maybe alternate methods to demonstrating that accountability through the remediation lead. And I did get to my second one, which is workforce development and the impact of SOLs on that as well. But those are the 2 big themes. And I look forward to talking to Mr. Malloy more about that. I think our meeting is next week. But I do think that it needs to be discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you. I wanted my go back because, I appreciate what Mr. Malloy said, that through my advocacy and others, we do make mention of school nurses. But as Mr. Malloy and I talked extensively with Ms. Corbett-Sanders in our 2x2, right now, the Virginia state funding sends about $4 million a year to Fairfax County for its school clinics. How Fairfax County Public Schools then chooses to spend that money. The money we direct over to the county government is about $2 million, but what we do with the other $2 million is still unclear. Even the public health department is a bit unclear. But my concern is that not just for Fairfax County schools, but for all school systems around the Commonwealth, school nurses often tend to be unfunded, not just from not sufficiently funded by the state, but also not a structured priority within school operations. And so particularly given the high poverty numbers in Fairfax County and the access to preventative care for students. Also within the setting of COVID where we're at, I can't think of a more important time for us to be having an intentional conversation, making sure that the state truly provides more essential funding for our school clinics, and that includes school nurses. So I'll look forward to continuing my advocacy with my colleagues and working with Mr. Malloy on maybe some possible legislative language. But I would like to see it more than just referenced as the term school nurses buried in our legislative priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. I'm just trying to get my mic on. Couple of points. I welcome the opportunity to work with you, Ms. Fairfax, in terms of finding a work session where we can come together and really hone in on the priorities, particularly given that Ms. Sizemore Heiser had not had a chance to speak with Michael Malloy. But I do want to echo what Ms. Marin said after she spoke. After my previous statements, we need to have a process that allows us to get to that prioritization rather than kind of what we're doing right now, which is building understanding, and that has its space as well. But I am looking for whatever time we do build in does have that process so that we are getting to the core of the work rather than, you know, the 2x2s, which may be helpful, but I think prolongs the conversation and also does not speak to the transparency of our work. I also just want to echo what Ms. Cohen said. I do realize that it's probably has been very helpful in the past to keep some of the issues, although they have not been addressed, to keep them at the forefront. But we are in a year where we're still in a pandemic year, and the narrower our focus, the more I think efficient we can be in what we advocate for. So I do want to at least throw that out there. That would be kind of where I fall in terms of being really succinct in terms of our advocacy points. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more board members that want go backs? If not, I will try to wrap up this discussion. So let me put my camera on, guys. Hold on.
Ms. Kofax, Ms. Keys-Gamarra has her hand up.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra, do you want to go back? No, yeah, I thought she was.
No, I'm sorry. That was a leftover. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's what I thought. No worries.
Thank you.
So where we are right now, and as I said, I think this session has had unique challenges because of several reasons that I'm not going to go over again. So right now, what I would like to do, I would like to seek general consensus on the 25-page document with the changes as noted in the summary of recommended changes. Knowing, again, this is a general consensus, knowing at least one board member, I think maybe two, Michael, you said, I'm not sure who the other board member is, who you haven't spoken to directly. If that board member would kindly please go reach out to Michael and speak to him about what you think about the general program. And secondly, what I would like to recommend, and since the chair feels that it would be good to have another work session, I think the other work session should be on the state priority, on our pull out, our priority positions and what they are. But what I would still like to do is I would like board members to provide feedback on this list of 14 state priorities that Michael has. And we have another 6 on federal. I think federal is much easier. And Ms. Corbett Sanders, I will allow you to speak to that. But I think that's the way I would like to proceed for moving forward in this discussion, and then a further work session. So I see I have some questions here. Ms. McLaughlin?
I guess just briefly, since there is the goal to have another work session, and this is only about consensus, I'm a little bit puzzled as to why we need to be giving a green light consensus today on what Mr. Malloy has drafted. We'll vote on it in 2 weeks. That's for us to talk about at the board table at that point, after board members have a chance to talk with each other, see if there's any amendments that we might want to make. So I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with this notion that today, right now, we're giving consensus that, I mean, if the consensus is this will go to the board table as a listed action item, and then we're comfortable with following up with amendments either to this draft change, that's fine. But I'm certainly not going to signal right here, right now, that I'm fine with everything Mr. Malloy did, because I might have colleagues who write to me and say, I'd like to amend what Mr. Malloy did. So
No, and Ms. McLaughlin, I agree. I think it's the former. It's the first part of the statement that you talked about. It's a general consensus that what's here we can just as our starting point, but you know, our final action on this will be the 5th. There will be time to have conversation around that, and I appreciate that. It's more making certain that we understand if there are, making certain that you understand the recommended changes, what they are, and if there could be additions, we can still talk about that in the same way that we do any of our big items like budget, where you bring amendments to the table. What I'm trying to do, though, is just to get everyone understanding the process that needs to happen by the 5th. And I think if Michael can make these changes, take out, you know, the strike throughs and then start working from there. That's where the goal was today, to try to get.
I understand what you're saying. It's more of the consensus. The board says what Mr. Malloy has drafted and in the strike throughs, that will serve as the basis of the main motion, and then we will make any changes as individual board members or shared proposals. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you, Ms. Derenak Kofax, and thank you for your partnership with Mr. Malloy on putting together this program. I will suggest that we spent more than 2.5 hours. I have on my calendar almost 4 hours of all of us working together on this. So it has been something that you really have provided quite a bit of insight and input into. I am going to suggest something, given that we are time challenged, if we can decouple the overall legislative plan, and as you say, getting the general support or consensus to have Michael present that as a non-red line version for the evening of the 5th. And then for the prioritization, we do have a little bit more time on that prioritization document and reaching consensus for it, because we don't need to present it to our legislators until, I believe it's December.
No.
November 23rd is the
November
date that's been
23rd.
set
November
for the
23rd. And so giving the chair and vice chair a little bit more time that we have between now and November 23rd to have a more focused conversation on that prioritization document once we've adopted the overall legislative program. I think that might give us a little more flexibility, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. And thank you for remembering to point that out. That's exactly what we had discussed. And yes, no, my comments were, it just took us 2.5 hours just to go through the changes to ensure that we had everybody's. Yes, there were many more meetings. So to get us to where we are today. So yes, so if I could have the general, and Michael, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, just in terms of the mechanics of typically what will happen after a work session is you all will have the discussion about the strike through document, and then what you see at the board table when the document is up for final action, you will not see a strike through version. You will see a clean version of the legislative program with all of the legislative language changes. And this year, it'll be a little bit different because typically everything is embedded in the strike through version. This year, we have the add-on piece of the board priorities, which did not get incorporated into the strike-through, that we would combine the strike-through version, eliminate all the underline, all the strike-through, so that it's just clean wording, and then it would also incorporate all of the changes that are included on the board additions. We would leave the priority pages blank, in essence, for you to continue to have your discussion all the way up until November 5th. What you will see, and I think this gets also to the comment that Ms. McLaughlin made, is you see a clean version then the board can still have additional conversations about whether or not they want to add other items. As an example, a number of board members have mentioned, and I think it's probably a good suggestion, adding language in about flexibility on graduation and accreditation for students that are affected by COVID. So we can work on language between now and then include that as an additional amendment to the program. But after today's conversation, we will take all of the language that we have, all the strike through, all the underline, and turn it into a much nicer looking document. It'll be, the table of contents and formatting and everything. And that's what will be in front of you on November 5th as a board.
Thank you, Michael, for saying that. And with that, I would ask my colleagues to, just as Michael had outlined, and with Ms. McLaughlin's making sure we understand her advocacy, to know that there are opportunities to amend that we go and we allow what will be presented to us on the 5th, a updated version of this. We can add amendments. And also we will work with the chair and vice chair, Ms. Corbett Sanders, and I will work with Dr. Anderson and Ms. Pekarsky to get one more work session on the priority positions. And again, that does not have to be a part of our package on the 5th that will be voted on. We can put those, that documentation and paperwork anytime prior to November 23rd. So if I could see hands for consensus of moving forward in that way. I will say that's Ms. Corbett Sanders, Ms. McLaughlin, Ms. Tolan, Ms. Cohen, Mr. Frisch, myself, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, Dr. Anderson, Ms. Omesh, Ms. Marin, Ms. Pekarsky. Thank you so much. So this passes, this consensus will move forward. Michael has his direction. You will all have opportunities to reach out to Michael, Karen, or I with suggestions. And we will work with the chair and vice chair to get one more session where we can talk priorities.
Thank you, Ms. Dana Koufax and Ms. Corbett and Mr. Malloy. If that is the end of this session, we are at a break for lunch until the program review. I'm sorry, not the program review. The first quarter review, which is at 1:30, will be managed by Ms. Marin and Ms. Dana Koufax.
Thank you. Yes, we are adjourned with this session.
Thank you.
Have a great lunch. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Malloy.